prairie wind carried something more than dust across the Kansas grasslands in the spring of 1873. It carried whispers. Travelers who stopped at a small roadside and along the Osage Trail were never seen again. Their horses, their wagons, their very existence, erased as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Picture this. You're a weary traveler in 1873, riding through the desolate stretches of southeastern Kansas. The sun beats down mercilessly, and you haven't seen civilization for miles. Then, like a mirage, a humble cabin appears on the horizon. A hand-painted sign promises food and rest. You're exhausted, hungry, thirsty. You approach. A beautiful young woman greets you at the door with a smile. How could you possibly know that crossing that threshold would be the last decision you'd ever make? This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first serial killer family. A tale so dark, so methodically evil, that it would reshape how an entire nation understood the monsters that could hide in plain sight. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The year is 1870. Labette County, Kansas is still wild frontier, a place where the rule of law is more suggestion than certainty, where neighbors live miles apart, and where a man's past is rarely questioned. Into this lawless expanse came a family that would exploit every advantage the isolated prairie offered. They called themselves the Benders. John Bender Sr., his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. They were immigrants, they claimed, Germans seeking the American dream, like so many others flooding westward after the Civil War. They purchased land along the Great Osage Trail, one of the main routes connecting Independence, Kansas to the south. It was a strategic location, positioned perfectly to intercept travelers moving through the territory. The traffic was constant, salesmen, prospectors, settlers, drifters, people who wouldn't be immediately missed, people whose disappearances could be attributed to the dangers of frontier life, bandits, hostile territory, accidents, or simply getting lost in the vast emptiness. The Benders constructed a crude one-room cabin, dividing it with a canvas curtain. The front section served as a general store and inn, offering basic supplies and meals to passing travelers. The back section, hidden behind that curtain, was their living quarters, or so they told anyone who asked. The setup seemed innocent enough, a struggling frontier family trying to carve out survival by servicing the needs of travelers. Dozens of similar establishments dotted the western territories, but there was something unsettling about the Benders that neighbors couldn't quite articulate. Old Man Bender spoke almost no English, communicating mostly in guttural German and hand gestures. His wife Elvira was a severe woman with cold eyes that seemed to calculate rather than welcome. John Jr. appeared simple-minded, his movements awkward, his speech limited. And then there was Kate. Kate Bender was different. Beautiful, charismatic, and unnervingly intelligent. She spoke perfect English and presented herself as a spiritualist and healer. She placed advertisements in local newspapers, claiming she could communicate with the dead, cure illnesses, and see into the future. In an era when spiritualism was sweeping America, when parlor seances were fashionable entertainment, Kate's claims attracted attention. She held sessions in nearby towns, building a reputation that brought curious visitors directly to the Bender property. She was the face of the family, the lure that made the trap seem inviting. Local families who visited the Bender Inn for supplies noticed peculiarities. The canvas curtain that divided the cabin seemed strangely positioned. Guests were always seated with their backs to it, at a specific spot at the crude wooden table. Kate would engage them in conversation, her eyes bright and attentive, while her family moved quietly in the background. Some visitors reported feeling uneasy, as if they were being sized up. A few noticed that the Benders seemed particularly interested in whether travelers were expected at their destinations, whether anyone knew their route, whether they carried money. Most who felt that creeping unease simply left quickly, attributing their discomfort to the strangeness of frontier life. They were the lucky ones. They listened to that primal instinct that whispered danger. Others dismissed their suspicions. They stayed for a meal. They accepted Kate's invitation to sit at that specific spot at the table. They turned their backs to that canvas curtain, and they were never seen alive again. The Benders were ghosts long before they became killers. Every word they spoke about themselves was carefully constructed fiction, a performance so convincing that their neighbors accepted it without question. In the frontier territories of 1870s Kansas, reinvention was common. Men and women fled debts, scandals, and crimes, shedding their pasts like snakeskin. The Benders understood this unspoken agreement. Don't ask about yesterday, and yesterday won't ask about you. But who were they really? John Bender Sr. claimed to be a German immigrant, though his accent was inconsistent and his German seemed crude even to native speakers. Some who encountered him suspected he was Dutch. Others thought he might be American-born, faking an accent to maintain the family's immigrant story. He was approximately 60 years old, heavy-set, with a wild beard and eyes that revealed nothing. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were barely intelligible. Whether this was genuine language barrier or calculated deception remains unknown. What is certain is that his silence made him less memorable, harder to identify, harder to track. Elvira, who presented herself as his wife, was equally enigmatic. Tall, gaunt, and severe, she moved through the world with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed other humans as resources rather than people. Neighbors described her as unsettling, a woman whose rare smiles never reached her eyes. Some locals whispered that she and John Sr. weren't actually married, that their relationship was a convenient fiction. Others suggested she might be the true architect of whatever darkness emanated from that cabin, with John Sr. merely her accomplice. John Jr., their supposed son, was a puzzle wrapped in contradiction. In his mid-20s, he appeared slow-witted and clumsy, often staring vacantly when spoken to. Yet witnesses would later recall moments when that vacant expression slipped, revealing something calculating underneath. Was he genuinely simple-minded, or was it an act, a way to appear harmless, to be underestimated? On the frontier, a strong young man who seemed incapable of cunning would be dismissed as a threat. It was the perfect disguise for someone who needed to get close to victims without raising alarm. And then there was Kate, the crown jewel of their deception. Kate Bender was approximately 23 years old, attractive by frontier standards, with dark hair and striking features. But her real beauty was her intelligence. She was articulate, charming, and possessed an uncanny ability to read people. While her family grunted and gestured, Kate wove elaborate stories. She claimed to have psychic abilities, calling herself Professor Miss Katie Bender in newspaper advertisements. She offered to heal the sick, communicate with departed loved ones, and reveal hidden truths through spiritual connection. This wasn't mere con artistry. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation. Spiritualism in the 1870s was a cultural phenomenon that had swept from the East Coast to the frontier. The Civil War had left countless families desperate to contact dead soldiers, and spiritualists filled that void with seances and supernatural claims. Kate positioned herself within this movement, understanding that it gave her legitimacy, access, and most importantly, it brought potential victims directly to her door. Her advertisements appeared in newspapers across Kansas. Professor Miss Katie Bender can heal all sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases, also deaf and dumbness. Residence, 14 miles east of Independence, on the road from Independence to Osage Mission 1, and 1/2 miles south of Moorhead Station. Katie Bender. People came. The curious, the desperate, the believing. Kate would perform her seances, charge her fees, and send most visitors away impressed by her performance. But some visitors, those who appeared wealthy, who traveled alone, who mentioned they were heading south with no one expecting them, received special attention. These visitors were invited to stay for a meal, to rest before continuing their journey, to sit at that specific spot at the table, backs to the canvas curtain, while Kate kept them distracted with conversation. The family dynamics were strange enough that some visitors commented on them. The way Elvira and Kate seemed to communicate without words. The way John Jr. would position himself near exits, blocking escape routes without appearing threatening. The way Old Man Bender would disappear behind the curtain for long periods. The sounds of digging audible even through the canvas. One neighbor, a man named Rudolph Brockman, visited the Benders multiple times and later recalled feeling that the family operated like a well-rehearsed theater troupe. Each member had a role, performed with precision. Kate was the attraction, drawing crowds and disarming suspicions. Elvira was the enforcer, cold and watchful. John Jr. was the muscle, stronger than his simple demeanor suggested. And Old Man Bender was the executioner, waiting in the shadows. But this was all speculation, impressions and unease that wouldn't crystallize into horror until much later. In 1871 and 1872, the Benders were simply odd frontier folk running a struggling roadside inn. Eccentric, perhaps. Unwelcoming, certainly. But dangerous? No one wanted to believe that. Not yet. Not until the disappearances became impossible to ignore. The first vanishing that caught official attention was a man named Jones. In late 1871, he left Independence heading south on the Osage Trail with a wagon full of goods and enough money in his pocket to start fresh somewhere warmer. His family expected a letter within weeks confirming his safe arrival. That letter never came. Months passed. His relatives made inquiries, sent telegrams, even hired someone to retrace his route. Jones had simply evaporated somewhere between Independence and the Oklahoma border. Frontier life was dangerous. Everyone accepted this reality. Men died from disease, accidents, exposure, and violence with tragic regularity. A missing traveler was unfortunate, but not unusual. The prairie was vast, unforgiving, and full of unmarked graves. So Jones's disappearance was noted, mourned, and then filed away as another casualty of westward expansion. But Jones wasn't alone. In early 1872, a man named Benjamin Brown vanished. He'd been seen passing through the area where the Bender Inn stood, asking for directions at a nearby homestead just 3 miles from their property. He mentioned stopping for supplies before continuing south. He never arrived at his destination. His horse and wagon gone. His belongings gone. The man himself erased as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Then came William Jones and his 3-year-old daughter, a widower traveling with his only child, hoping to reunite with family in Texas. Multiple witnesses placed them on the Osage Trail in March 1872. A neighbor spotted William's distinctive wagon near the Bender property. After that, nothing. A father and his little girl, swallowed by the prairie. When search parties combed the area, they found no trace, no abandoned wagon, no signs of struggle, no bodies. It was as if the earth had opened and consumed them whole. The disappearances followed a pattern, though no one had yet connected the dots. The missing were always traveling alone or in very small groups. They were always moving south on the Osage Trail. They always passed through the stretch of territory where the Bender Inn offered its grim hospitality. And they always seemed to vanish within a 5-mile radius of that canvas-divided cabin. George Lanscher was next, a German immigrant himself. He was traveling to meet his infant daughter, who'd been left with relatives after his wife died in childbirth. In December 1872, he stopped at the Bender Inn. Some accounts suggest he spoke German with Old Man Bender, perhaps feeling a kinship with fellow immigrants. He mentioned his route, his plans, the fact that no one expected him for several weeks. He sat down for a meal. He turned his back to that canvas curtain. George Lanscher's brother, who'd been traveling separately but planned to meet him further south, arrived at their rendezvous point to find George missing. Concerned, he backtracked along the Osage Trail, questioning everyone he encountered. Several people remembered seeing George. A blacksmith recalled shoeing his horse. A store owner remembered selling him tobacco. And multiple witnesses confirmed he'd stopped at the Bender property. When the brother confronted the Benders, Kate greeted him with her practiced charm. Yes, she remembered his brother, a pleasant gentleman who'd taken a meal before continuing his journey. She'd even given him directions to a shortcut that would save him time. Perhaps he'd taken that route. Perhaps he'd run into trouble along that less-traveled path. She seemed genuinely concerned, even offering to hold a seance to contact his brother's spirit if he feared the worst. The brother left unsatisfied but without proof of any wrongdoing. Still, he filed a report with local authorities. It was added to a growing stack of missing person cases that all shared one common thread: the Osage Trail and the strange family that lived along it. By early 1873, whispers had become conversations. Travelers began avoiding the Bender Inn, choosing to push through exhaustion rather than stop at that increasingly infamous location. Those who did stop reported the family's behavior had grown more aggressive. Kate's charm had acquired a desperate edge. Elvira watched visitors with predatory intensity. John Jr. positioned himself between guests and the door. The family seemed to sense that their window of opportunity was closing. Then came Dr. William York, and everything changed. Dr. York was not some anonymous drifter who could disappear without consequence. He was a respected physician from Independence, Kansas, a man of standing with family, friends, and connections throughout the territory. In March 1873, he was traveling to Fort Scott to visit his brother, Colonel Alexander York. The colonel was a prominent figure, a Civil War veteran with political influence and the resources to conduct a real investigation. Dr. York's route took him directly past the Bender property. Several witnesses saw him riding through the area on March 9th. He mentioned to a neighbor that he planned to stop at the Bender place to ask about a missing man named George Launcher, whose case he'd been following. The neighbor warned him to be careful. There were rumors about that family. Dr. York replied that he was armed and capable of handling himself. He continued toward the Bender Inn. He was never seen alive again. When Dr. York failed to arrive at Fort Scott, Colonel York didn't accept vague explanations about frontier dangers. He immediately organized a search party, offering substantial rewards for information. He had the authority, the determination, and the connections to turn over every stone until he found answers. The colonel retraced his brother's route methodically, interviewing everyone, examining every detail, and all roads led to the Benders. Colonel Alexander York was not a man who accepted mysteries. When his brother vanished, he approached the problem with military precision, mapping the route, interviewing witnesses, documenting every detail. Within days, he'd reconstructed Dr. York's final journey with chilling accuracy. The doctor had been seen at multiple locations along the Osage Trail, always heading in the same direction, always moving closer to the Bender property. The colonel's investigation revealed something else, something that transformed isolated disappearances into a recognizable pattern. He discovered that at least a dozen men had vanished along this same stretch of trail over the past 2 years. Different backgrounds, different destinations, but always the same location where the trail went cold. Always within miles of that canvas-divided cabin where a strange family offered food and rest to weary travelers. In April 1873, Colonel York organized a town meeting in nearby Cherryvale. Over 100 settlers attended, their faces grim as they listened to the litany of missing persons. The colonel stood before them and laid out his findings with prosecutorial clarity. He named the missing: Jones, Brown, Launcher, William Jones and his 3-year-old daughter, and now his own brother. He traced their routes on a hand-drawn map, each line converging on the Bender property like spokes on a wheel. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The Benders were invited to attend this meeting, to clear their names, to offer explanations, to help with the investigation if they were truly innocent. They came, and their performance was remarkable. Kate Bender stood before that crowd of suspicious settlers and delivered a masterclass in manipulation. She spoke with indignation, her voice ringing with wounded innocence. How dare these people accuse her family of such horrors? They were simple, God-fearing folk trying to survive on the brutal frontier. Yes, travelers stopped at their inn. That was their livelihood. Yes, some of those travelers later went missing, but the prairie was vast and dangerous. Bandits roamed freely. Wild animals attacked. Men got lost, fell into ravines, died of exposure. To blame her family for tragedies beyond their control was persecution, plain and simple. She wept. She quoted scripture. She reminded the crowd that she was a spiritualist dedicated to helping others connect with departed loved ones. Would someone with such gifts use them for evil? She even offered to conduct a seance right there, to contact the spirits of the missing men and ask them what truly happened. It was a brilliant strategy. In an era when spiritualism was treated with quasi-religious reverence, Kate's offer put the accusers in an impossible position. To refuse seemed like rejecting the very possibility of supernatural intervention. To accept meant participating in a theatrical performance the Benders controlled. Old Man Bender sat silently throughout the meeting, his face a mask of incomprehension. Whether he genuinely didn't understand English or was simply maintaining his character, the effect was the same. He appeared too simple, too confused, to mastermind anything sinister. Elvira watched the proceedings with cold detachment, occasionally nodding or shaking her head when Kate solicited her agreement. John Jr. fidgeted like a nervous child, his vacant expression suggesting he barely understood why they were there. Colonel York watched them carefully. He was a military man, trained to assess threats and identify deception. He saw through Kate's performance, recognized the calculated nature of her emotional display. But he also understood the limitations of frontier justice. Without physical evidence, without bodies, without witnesses to an actual crime, he couldn't act. Suspicion wasn't enough to arrest them. Rumors weren't enough to convict them. The meeting ended inconclusively. The Benders were warned they remained under suspicion and would be watched closely. Kate responded with gracious understanding. Of course they should be watched if it would help ease the community's fears. They had nothing to hide. Their door was always open. Come search their property if it would help. Please, do whatever necessary to find the truth. This invitation was another calculated move. The Benders knew that a search conducted while they were present and prepared would reveal nothing. The bodies, if there were bodies, would be well hidden. The evidence, if there was evidence, would be carefully concealed. And the act of searching and finding nothing would actually strengthen their claim of innocence. Several men did search the property that very day, walking through the cabin, examining the sparse furnishings, checking the small barn and the surrounding land. They found nothing suspicious. The cabin was poor but unremarkable. The cellar beneath contained only root vegetables and supplies. The land showed signs of recent farming, disturbed earth where crops might be planted. Everything seemed to match the story of a struggling frontier family. But one searcher, a man named Billy Toll, noticed something odd. Behind the cabin, there was a small orchard of young fruit trees. The ground beneath them appeared softer than it should, as if it had been dug up and refilled recently. When he mentioned this, Kate explained that they'd been fertilizing the soil to help the trees grow. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly innocent. Toll pressed his boot against the earth. It gave way slightly, as if the ground beneath was loose, not fully settled. He suggested they dig. Kate's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, something cold and calculating. Before Toll could pursue his suggestion, Colonel York intervened. Digging up someone's orchard based on nothing more than soft soil would be overreach. They needed more than hunches. The searchers left. The Benders smiled and waved. Kate called out that she hoped they'd find Dr. York safe and sound. She would pray for him, she said. She would ask the spirits to guide him home. That night, the Benders held a family conference. The walls were closing in. The colonel was relentless, organized, and resourceful. More searches would come, and eventually, someone would dig in the right place. Eventually, someone would look behind the canvas curtain with the right amount of suspicion. Eventually, the soft earth beneath the orchard would give up its terrible secrets. They had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before discovery became inevitable. The Benders made their decision. Under cover of darkness, they loaded a wagon with their most valuable possessions. They hitched their horses, extinguished the lamps, and slipped away from the property that had served as their killing ground for nearly 3 years. Nugo Odbis. No explanations. They simply vanished into the Kansas night, heading in a direction no one could trace. When the sun rose the next morning, the Bender property stood silent and abandoned. The door swung open in the prairie wind. The canvas curtain fluttered like a ghost. And beneath the soft earth of that young orchard, the truth waited to be uncovered. When neighbors discovered the Bender property abandoned on the morning of May 5, 1873, their first reaction was relief. The strange family was gone. Let them be someone else's problem. Perhaps the accusations had driven them away. Perhaps they'd simply tired of frontier life and moved on. Good riddance to unsettling people who'd brought nothing but suspicion and unease to Labette County. But Colonel York saw the abandonment differently. Innocent people didn't flee in the night. Innocent people didn't leave behind property, livestock, and possessions without explanation. The Benders' sudden disappearance wasn't an admission of guilt in the legal sense, but it was an answer nonetheless. They'd run because they had something to hide. Something so terrible that facing a search was impossible. York organized a thorough investigation of the property. This time, there would be no polite requests, no restrictions on where they could look. Every inch of that cabin, every foot of that land, would be examined until the truth revealed itself. On May 9th, a group of men descended on the abandoned homestead with shovels, determination, and a growing sense of dread. The cabin itself told a story once you knew to look for it. That canvas curtain wasn't simply a room divider. It was a theater curtain, positioned precisely to hide what happened behind it. The dinner table where guests were invited to sit had a specific chair, worn more than the others, positioned with its back to the curtain. Guests were always directed to that particular seat. Always. Behind the curtain, the floor showed suspicious stains that someone had attempted to scrub away. Dark patches that could be blood, though the wood was so crude and weathered it was difficult to be certain. The men tore up the floorboards, revealing the shallow cellar beneath. The smell that rose from that dark space made several men gag, a thick, sickly sweet odor of decomposition that clung to the throat. But the cellar itself contained no bodies, only more stains, only evidence of something terrible being dragged across the dirt floor toward a trap door that led outside, to the back of the property, to the orchard. Billy Toll remembered the soft earth beneath those young fruit trees. He led the search party to that spot, and without hesitation this time, began to dig. His shovel sank easily into soil that had been disturbed recently, not packed down by seasons and weather. 3 feet down, his blade struck something solid but yielding, something that wasn't rock or root. The men dug carefully now, the awful smell growing stronger with every shovelful of earth removed. And then they saw it, a human foot, partially decomposed, still wearing a boot. They'd found the first body. Dr. William York lay in a shallow grave, face down, his skull caved in from behind. The back of his head showed a massive indentation consistent with being struck by a heavy, blunt object wielded with tremendous force. A hammer, most likely. One crushing blow that had killed him instantly, or left him unconscious before his throat was cut. The gaping wound across his neck was still visible despite decomposition. Colonel York stood over his brother's grave, his face carved from stone, as the diggers carefully removed the body. This was no longer a missing person case. This was murder, and the crime scene was about to get exponentially worse. Within feet of Dr. York, they found another body. Then another. Then another. The orchard was a graveyard, and each grave told the same horrifying story. Victims had been struck from behind with crushing force, their skulls shattered. Some had their throats cut for good measure. All had been stripped of valuables, clothing, and anything that could identify them. They'd been dumped in shallow pits and covered with earth that would be fertilized by their decomposition, nourishing the young fruit trees above. George Lawnshare was there, the German immigrant who'd spoken his native language with Old Man Bender, who trusted fellow foreigners and paid for that trust with his life. William Jones was there, along with his 3-year-old daughter, the child's small body a testament to the Benders' absolute ruthlessness. Benjamin Brown, Jones, others whose names had been forgotten, but whose disappearances were now explained with terrible clarity. The final count was 11 bodies, though some were so decomposed that identification was impossible. 11 confirmed victims, but the true number might be higher. The Benders had lived on that property for nearly 3 years. How many travelers had stopped for a meal and never left? How many graves might be scattered elsewhere on the property, in locations not yet discovered? The methodology became clear as investigators pieced together the crime scene. A traveler would arrive, tired and hungry. Kate would greet them with her charm, invite them inside for a meal. They'd be directed to sit at that specific spot, the chair with its back to the canvas curtain. Kate would engage them in conversation, keeping their attention focused forward while asking seemingly innocent questions. Where are you heading? Who's expecting you? Are you traveling with money? Meanwhile, behind the curtain, a family member waited with a hammer. Old Man Bender, most likely, or perhaps John Jr. when strength was needed. They'd listen to Kate's conversation, wait for the perfect moment, then strike through the canvas curtain with devastating force. The hammer would crush through fabric and skull simultaneously. The victim would slump forward, dead or dying, blood pouring onto that worn wooden floor. Then the efficient butchery would begin. Throats were cut to ensure death and to bleed the body, making it easier to handle. Valuables were stripped, money, jewelry, weapons, anything of worth. The body would be dragged through the trap door into the cellar, then out through the back exit to the orchard. A shallow grave would be dug, the body dumped unceremoniously, and earth piled on top. Plant a fruit tree above. By next season, the roots would reach down into human remains, drawing nutrients from death to sustain life. It was methodical, practiced, a system refined over dozens of murders. This wasn't passion or rage, this was business. The Benders had turned murder into a sustainable enterprise, viewing travelers not as human beings, but as resources to be harvested. The discovery sent shockwaves through Kansas and beyond. Newspapers across America ran headlines about the Bloody Benders and the Kansas murder farm. The story had everything readers craved: a beautiful female killer, a family conspiracy, unsuspecting victims, and the macabre detail of bodies fertilizing fruit trees. It was Gothic horror made real, and the nation couldn't look away. But even as the bodies were being cataloged and the investigation expanded, one question dominated every conversation. Where were the Benders now? The excavation of the Bender property continued for days, each shovelful of earth potentially hiding another victim. Volunteers came from neighboring counties, driven by morbid curiosity and the desperate hope that they might find a missing loved one. The orchard wasn't the only burial ground. Investigators discovered evidence of graves near the barn, along the property line, even beneath the cabin's foundation itself. But it was the stories the bodies told that truly horrified investigators. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. The forensic evidence, primitive as 1873 medical examination was, revealed a pattern of brutality that suggested the Benders had refined their killing method through trial and error. Early victims showed signs of struggle, defensive wounds, broken fingers from trying to ward off blows. Later victims showed no such signs, indicating the family had perfected their ambush technique. Dr. York's autopsy was performed by a colleague who'd known him in life, a grim task that revealed the physician's final moments. The hammer blow had come from directly behind, slightly to the right, delivered with such force that the skull had fractured inward, driving bone fragments into the brain. Death would have been instantaneous, or nearly so. The throat wound was post-mortem, insurance, and perhaps a signature. The Benders weren't taking chances on a victim surviving that first blow. The 3-year-old daughter of William Jones presented a different horror. Her small skull showed the same massive trauma as the adults. The Benders hadn't hesitated to murder a child, hadn't shown mercy or basic human compassion. She was simply a witness who needed eliminating, a loose end to be tied up as efficiently as any other. Her father's body lay beside hers, both dumped into the same shallow grave, like discarded trash. One body, believed to be Benjamin Brown, showed evidence of something even more disturbing. His corpse bore wounds suggesting he hadn't died immediately from the hammer blow. Knife marks on his ribcage indicated he'd been stabbed multiple times while alive, whether in an attempt to finish him off or for some darker purpose. Investigators couldn't determine. The implication that some victims might have been conscious during their final moments, might have understood what was happening to them, added another layer of nightmare to an already incomprehensible crime. The cellar beneath the cabin became a focal point of forensic examination. The earth floor was stained black with dried blood, so much blood that it had soaked several inches deep into the packed dirt. Investigators calculated that the amount of blood present represented dozens of victims, far more than the 11 bodies recovered. Either there were graves yet to be discovered, or some bodies had been disposed of in ways that left no trace. A makeshift drain had been carved into the cellar floor, leading to an exterior pit. This is where the Benders had allowed excess blood to pool, letting it seep into the earth rather than accumulating in the cellar itself. The pit, when excavated, yielded bones, fragments too small or damaged to identify, but undeniably human. Finger bones, teeth, pieces of skull. A horrifying ossuary of victims who'd been reduced to anonymous remains. The property's inventory revealed the scope of the Benders' plunder. Hidden in various locations were items clearly taken from victims: watches, wallets, clothing, weapons, horse tack, even children's toys. Each item represented a life stolen, a person reduced to their portable possessions. Investigators attempted to match items to missing persons reports, creating a grim catalog of theft and murder. Some items bore initials or identifying marks that confirmed they'd belonged to specific victims. Others remained anonymous, their owners lost to history. One discovery chilled investigators to their core, a ledger, hidden beneath the loose floorboard. The handwriting was neat, methodical, unmistakably Kate's educated script. It contained dates, brief descriptions, and amounts. March 12th, traveling salesman, 47. June 3rd, settler with wagon, 23, and goods. September 18th, doctor passing through, 65. The ledger spanned nearly 2 years, with entries describing at least 18 transactions, 18 murders, recorded with the casual efficiency of a shopkeeper tracking sales. The ledger proved something investigators had suspected. Kate was the architect of this operation. She was educated, organized, and calculating in ways the rest of her family wasn't. She'd kept records, maintained their murder business, with the same attention to detail a legitimate merchant would apply to inventory management. The ledger also suggested the benders had been selective. They'd passed up victims who seemed too risky, who might be traveling in groups or expected at nearby destinations. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated predation. Neighbors who'd visited the Bender property came forward with new details, their earlier observations taking on sinister meaning in retrospect. One woman recalled that Kate had once shown her the canvas curtain, explaining it was treated with some substance to make it more durable. In hindsight, the woman realized it might have been treated to prevent blood from soaking through and alerting victims on the other side. Another neighbor remembered seeing the Benders burning something in a large fire pit behind the cabin. He'd assumed they were clearing brush, but now wondered if they'd been destroying evidence. A traveling preacher, who'd stopped at the inn months earlier, recalled the family, insisting he sit in that particular chair. He'd refused, preferring to stand while he ate, and remembered how Kate's smile had tightened, how Elvira's eyes had followed him with unusual intensity. He'd felt unwelcome suddenly, and left quickly, attributing the strange atmosphere to religious prejudice. Now he understood. He'd narrowly escaped becoming another entry in Kate's ledger. The question everyone asked was why? What drove a family to commit such horrors? Greed was the obvious answer. The Benders had accumulated modest wealth from their victims' possessions, but the sheer scale of the killing suggested something beyond simple robbery. There was an efficiency, an emotional detachment, that seemed almost inhuman. They'd murdered men, women, and children without hesitation, reduced human beings to financial transactions, buried them like garbage, and planted trees over their graves. Some theorized they'd done this before, that the Bender property wasn't their first killing ground. The sophistication of their operation, the rehearsed nature of their roles, suggested experience. Had they murdered in Germany, or wherever they'd actually come from? Had they killed along the trail before settling in Kansas? Were there other orchards somewhere, other properties, where unsuspecting travelers had been systematically slaughtered? The press devoured these questions, printing increasingly lurid accounts that transformed the Benders from criminals into mythic monsters. Kate became the beautiful butcher, a seductress who lured men to their deaths. Old Man Bender became the hammer fiend, a silent executioner who struck from shadows. John Jr. was the devil simpleton, hiding cunning behind a mask of stupidity. Elvira was the witch of Kansas, cold and pitiless as the prairie winter. But underneath the sensationalized headlines was a truth more disturbing than any fiction. The Benders were human beings who'd chosen to become monsters. They'd looked at their fellow humans and seen only opportunity. They'd sat across from travelers, shared meals, made conversation, all while planning murder. They'd walked past graves daily, tended trees nourished by corpses, and slept soundly at night. And now they were gone, vanished into the vast American landscape, possibly hunting new victims in some other territory where no one knew their faces or their crimes. News of the Bender murders spread across America with the speed of telegraph wires, and the nation reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination that would define true crime coverage for generations to come. The story had every element the Victorian public craved: Gothic atmosphere, a femme fatale, family conspiracy, and a body count that climbed with each new excavation. Newspapers competed to print the most shocking details, often embellishing facts with speculation that transformed the Benders from mere killers into legendary bogeymen. The New York Times devoted front-page coverage to the Kansas Fiends, describing the murder cabin in prose so purple it read, like a penny dreadful. The Chicago Tribune sent reporters to interview survivors, people who'd stopped at the Bender Inn and lived to tell about it. Their accounts now taking on prophetic significance. Every person who'd felt uneasy around the Benders, every traveler who declined to stay for a meal, became a minor celebrity with a brush-with-death story to share. But behind the sensationalism was genuine trauma rippling through Kansas and beyond. Families with missing loved ones flooded authorities with inquiries, desperate to know if their father, brother, or son might be among the bodies recovered from that cursed orchard. The 11 confirmed dead represented only a fraction of the people who'd vanished along the Osage Trail during the Bender's tenure. For every body identified, dozens more families were left in agonizing uncertainty. The identification process was gruesome and imperfect. In 1873, fingerprinting hadn't been invented, dental records were non-existent, and bodies buried for months or years in Kansas soil were often deteriorated beyond visual recognition. Investigators relied on clothing scraps, personal effects, and physical descriptions provided by grieving families. A distinctive watch identified one victim. A wedding ring with an inscription confirmed another. But several bodies remained nameless, buried eventually in unmarked graves after no one came forward to claim them. The town of Cherryvale found itself transformed overnight from an anonymous frontier settlement into a destination for the morbidly curious. Within weeks of the discovery, hundreds of people descended on the Bender property, treating it like a macabre tourist attraction. They walked through the murder cabin, posed for photographs beside the orchard graves, and carved pieces of wood from the structure as souvenirs. The canvas curtain, that blood-soaked theatrical prop behind which hammers had fallen, was cut into strips and sold to collectors. Local entrepreneurs capitalized on the tragedy with disturbing enthusiasm. One businessman purchased the Bender cabin and charged admission for tours, employing a guide who embellished details with each retelling. Another sold authentic Bender artifacts, hammers supposedly used in the murders, pieces of furniture from the cabin, even jars of soil from the graves. Most were fake, manufactured to meet demand, but buyers snapped them up regardless. The murder farm had become a commodity. This grotesque commercialization horrified Colonel York, who'd lost his brother to the Bender's brutality. He watched in disgust as his family's tragedy became entertainment, as William York's murder site turned into a carnival attraction. He threw himself into the manhunt with renewed intensity, determined that the Benders would face justice rather than transform into profitable folklore. The investigation into the Benders' escape route began immediately. Neighbors reported seeing the family depart during the night of May 4th or early morning of May 5th. They'd loaded a wagon, not heavily, suggesting they'd abandoned most possessions and headed northeast, away from the Osage Trail, where they'd be recognized. But from there, the trail went cold. The Benders had vanished as completely as their victims had. Wanted posters appeared across Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. The descriptions were detailed. Kate Bender, approximately 23 years old, 5 feet 6 inches, dark hair, attractive, educated, speaks perfect English. John Bender Sr., approximately 60, heavyset, speaks broken English or German. Elvira Bender, approximately 55, tall, gaunt, severe features. John Bender Jr., approximately 25, stocky build, appears simple-minded. The reward for information leading to their capture was substantial, $500 per Bender, a fortune in 1873. Tips flooded in from across the country. The Benders were spotted in Texas, in Missouri, in Colorado, in California. Every sighting was investigated, every lead followed, but none panned out. Some were cases of mistaken identity. Others were deliberate hoaxes by people seeking reward money. A few were likely the Benders themselves, spotted briefly before disappearing again into the anonymous masses of westward migration. One promising lead emerged from Missouri. A family matching the Benders' description had been seen boarding a train in St. Louis, heading east. Railroad agents were alerted, and lawmen waited at stations along the route, but no one matching the descriptions disembarked at monitored locations. Had they exited at a small rural stop? Changed their appearance? Split up to avoid detection? Another credible sighting came from Texas. A woman resembling Kate had been performing spiritualist shows in San Antonio, using the name Professor Sarah Davis. When authorities arrived to investigate, the woman had already departed, leaving no forwarding address. A landlord reported she'd lived with 3 family members who kept to themselves, an older couple and a young man who seemed slow-witted. The timing matched the Benders' escape, and the modus operandi was identical, but by the time investigators connected the dots, the trail was months cold. The frustrating reality was that the American frontier in 1873 was perfectly designed for fugitives. Vast territories with sparse populations, poor communication between jurisdictions, and a cultural norm of not questioning people's pasts. The Benders could reinvent themselves in any of 100 towns, change their names, alter their stories, and disappear into legitimate obscurity. Kate could become a schoolteacher. Elvira could be a seamstress. The men could be farmhands or laborers. Without photographs, and none existed of the Benders, identification relied entirely on physical descriptions and recognition, both easily defeated with minor changes. Vigilante groups formed, frustrated by the slow pace of official investigation. These posses ranged from legitimate concerned citizens to violent opportunists who used the manhunt as cover for settling personal scores. Several innocent families were terrorized by mobs, convinced they were the Benders in disguise. In Oklahoma Territory, a German immigrant family was nearly lynched before cooler heads prevailed and established their identities. The hysteria surrounding the case made rational investigation increasingly difficult. Colonel York received letters, hundreds of them. Some offered genuine tips and assistance. Others were cruel hoaxes, claiming to be from Kate Bender herself, taunting him with details of his brother's murder. One particularly vicious letter described Dr. York's final moments in graphic detail, how he'd begged for his life, how Kate had laughed as the hammer fell. Handwriting experts couldn't determine if it was authentic or an elaborate forgery by someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes. As months passed without capture, public attention began to wane. New scandals emerged, new horrors captured headlines. The Bender murders became yesterday's news, filed away in the public consciousness as another dark chapter in frontier history. But for the families of victims, for Colonel York, for the people of Lebec County who'd lived alongside monsters without knowing it, the horror remained fresh and immediate. The unanswered question haunted everyone. Were the Benders still out there, living under new identities, perhaps even killing again in some other location where no one had yet connected the disappearances? Or had they met their own violent end, killed by fellow criminals or vigilantes who'd recognized them and delivered frontier justice without bothering with courts? The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden somewhere in the vast American landscape, guarded by the same frontier anonymity that had allowed the Benders to kill with impunity for nearly 3 years. The Bender case didn't just horrify America, it fundamentally changed how Americans understood evil. Before the bloody Benders, violent crime was generally seen as the work of individuals, outlaws, bandits, or madmen acting alone. The concept of an entire family conspiring to commit serial murder was so alien, so antithetical to Victorian notions of family as a sacred institution, that it shattered cultural assumptions about where safety could be found. If a family, the basic unit of civilization, the foundation of moral society, could be rotten to its core, then nowhere was truly safe. The home, that supposed sanctuary, could be a slaughterhouse. The hospitable innkeeper could be a calculating killer. The beautiful young woman offering spiritual guidance could be counting your money, while her father waited behind a curtain with a hammer. Trust itself became suspect. This psychological impact rippled through frontier communities with devastating effect. Travelers became paranoid, avoiding small roadside establishments and sleeping outdoors rather than risk unknown accommodations. Legitimate innkeepers saw their business collapse as former customers chose hunger and exhaustion over the possibility of becoming the next victim. Some establishments hung prominent signs advertising their respectability, listing references and testimonials, desperate to distance themselves from the Bender legacy. The paranoia extended beyond simple caution. In Kansas and neighboring territories, families who kept to themselves or seemed strange in any way found themselves under suspicion. German immigrants, who'd once been welcomed as hard-working additions to frontier communities, faced increased hostility and discrimination. The Benders had claimed to be German, and that association poisoned relations. Attractive young women who worked in family businesses were viewed with sudden suspicion. Was that friendly smile genuine? Or was she sizing you up as a potential victim? Church leaders and social reformers seized on the case as evidence of moral decay on the frontier. Sermons condemned the lawlessness of the territories, arguing that the Bender murders were inevitable in a society that had abandoned traditional values and oversight. Temperance advocates blamed alcohol. Surely the Benders had been drunk or driven by liquor sales. Women's rights opponents pointed to Kate as proof that educated, independent women were dangerous aberrations from natural feminine virtue. These reactionary interpretations missed the deeper, more disturbing truth. The Benders were rational actors who'd made calculated decisions based on opportunity and risk assessment. They weren't mad in any clinical sense, weren't driven by delusions or uncontrollable impulses. They'd identified a systemic vulnerability, isolated travelers on remote trails, and exploited it with businesslike efficiency. Their evil was banal, methodical, and could emerge anywhere similar conditions existed. Detective Alan Pinkerton, whose agency was becoming famous for tracking outlaws across state lines, took personal interest in the case. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had resources no local sheriff could match, a national network of operatives, advanced investigative techniques, and the ability to pursue fugitives indefinitely. Pinkerton assigned some of his best agents to the Bender manhunt, treating it as both a professional challenge and a public relations opportunity. The Pinkerton investigation uncovered details that deepened the mystery. Agents traced the Benders backward from Kansas, attempting to establish their origins and previous activities. They discovered that Bender likely wasn't even their real name. No immigration records matched their descriptions. No German town claimed them as former residents. The family had materialized in Kansas in 1870 with manufactured identities and well-rehearsed backstories. Even more disturbing, Pinkerton agents found suggestions of similar unsolved murders along other migration routes. In Missouri, a series of missing persons cases from 1868 to 1869 bore striking similarities to the Kansas murders. Travelers vanishing near small roadside establishments, bodies occasionally discovered bearing hammer wounds and having been stripped of valuables. In Iowa, a family matching vague descriptions of the Benders had operated in briefly before abandoning it suddenly in 1867. No bodies were found on that property, but several travelers had disappeared in the area during the family's tenure. Were the Benders serial killers before they even arrived in Kansas? Had they refined their techniques across multiple locations, perfecting their system through years of practice? The evidence was circumstantial but suggestive. If true, it meant the 11 confirmed Kansas victims represented only a fraction of their total body count. The bloody Benders might have murdered dozens, perhaps over 100 people, across multiple states and territories. This possibility terrified law enforcement because it implied sophistication beyond anything they'd encountered. These weren't impulsive killers who'd eventually make fatal mistakes. They were nomadic predators who could establish themselves in a location, kill systematically until discovery seemed imminent, then disappear and restart elsewhere under new identities. How did you catch someone like that in an era before national law enforcement coordination, before fingerprints or photographs were standard investigative tools? The frustration drove some investigators to extreme measures. Colonel York, increasingly consumed by his quest for justice, began pursuing leads personally rather than trusting official channels. In 1874, he traveled to Texas based on a tip that Kate Bender had been spotted in Dallas. The lead proved false, but while there, York encountered dozens of other families searching for missing loved ones, all hoping their disappeared might be found alive, all fearing they'd ended up in some other murderer's orchard. York realized the Bender case was just the tip of a much larger problem. The American frontier was dotted with missing person cases, with disappearances that were attributed to accidents or natural causes, but might be murders that were never investigated thoroughly. How many other murder farms existed? How many other families had discovered that killing travelers was profitable and relatively safe? The Benders hadn't invented their system. They'd just gotten caught. This realization led to one of the first attempts at coordinated multi-jurisdictional law enforcement in American history. York, with support from Kansas officials and the Pinkerton Agency, organized a network of sheriffs and marshals across Western territories to share information about unsolved disappearances. It was primitive by modern standards, letters and telegrams instead of databases, but it represented a significant evolution in investigative thinking. The network immediately revealed patterns that local investigators had missed. Certain routes showed clusters of disappearances. Certain types of establishments, small family run-ins in isolated locations, were disproportionately associated with missing persons cases. Some proprietors had histories of moving frequently, always seeming to leave just before questions about disappearances became too pointed. The data suggested there might be dozens of operations similar to the Benders, scattered across the frontier. Law enforcement began conducting raids on suspicious establishments, sometimes based on nothing more than patterns that resembled the Bender operation. Most raids found nothing. Legitimate families were traumatized by armed men tearing up their property searching for graves that didn't exist. But occasionally, they found something. In Oklahoma in 1874, authorities discovered another murder cabin with a familiar setup. A canvas divider, a specific chair positioned with its back to the curtain, and suspicious stains on the floor. 3 bodies were recovered from the property. The family had fled weeks earlier, warned perhaps by news of increasing law enforcement scrutiny. They were never identified or captured. In Missouri, a raid uncovered 2 bodies buried near an inn operated by a couple who disappeared suddenly. In Colorado, investigators found evidence suggesting murders had occurred at a trading post, though no bodies were recovered and the proprietors had vanished years earlier. Each discovery validated the growing understanding that the Benders weren't aberrations. They were examples of a systemic predation that the frontier's isolation made possible. But none of these discoveries answered the central question that obsessed the public. Where were the Benders themselves? Despite thousands of man-hours, despite rewards that had grown to over $2,000, despite wanted posters distributed to every corner of the nation, the family remained ghosts. They'd achieved what few fugitives ever managed, complete disappearance. As 1874 turned to 1875, the active manhunt began to wind down. Resources were redirected to other cases. New crimes demanded attention. The Pinkerton Agency, while maintaining the case as technically open, assigned fewer agents. Colonel York continued his personal search, but even his determination began to flag under the weight of dead ends and false leads. The Benders were becoming legend now, transitioning from criminals to folklore. Stories spread claiming they'd been spotted everywhere from Canada to Mexico, from California to New York. Some tales had them killed by vigilantes. Others imagined them living in luxury somewhere, spending their victims' money. A few particularly dark stories suggested they'd simply started over under new names, perhaps in a new location, killing a new set of unsuspecting travelers. The truth, as always, remained elusive, but America had learned a terrible lesson about the monsters that could hide behind ordinary faces, about the evil that could operate in plain sight when isolation and opportunity aligned. The bloody Benders had changed the nation's understanding of crime, of family, and of the darkness that could lurk behind a welcoming smile. The years following the Bender murders spawned countless theories about the family's fate, each more elaborate than the last. Some were based on genuine investigative leads, others on pure speculation, and a few on deliberate hoaxes designed to revive public interest and sell newspapers. But beneath the sensationalism and misinformation were several credible accounts that suggested the Bender story didn't end with their midnight escape from Kansas. The most persistent theory held that vigilantes had caught and executed the Benders before they could escape the region. This version appeared in dozens of variations, but the core narrative remained consistent. A posse of outraged citizens, unwilling to trust the slow machinery of frontier justice, had tracked the family down within days of their flight and delivered immediate retribution. The bodies, according to these accounts, were buried in unmarked graves or destroyed entirely to avoid legal complications for the vigilantes. One particular version of this theory gained traction in 1889, 16 years after the murders, when an elderly man on his deathbed in Kansas allegedly confessed to participating in the Benders' execution. He claimed a group of 18 men had pursued the family into Indian Territory, caught them attempting to cross into Texas, and killed them all, shooting the men, hanging Kate and Elvira. The bodies were reportedly thrown into a ravine and covered with rocks. The vigilantes swore an oath of secrecy that they maintained for nearly 2 decades. The confession was detailed and internally consistent, including names of other participants, specific geographic locations, and a timeline that aligned with the Benders' disappearance. Several newspapers printed it as fact, and for a time, it seemed the mystery was finally solved. But investigation revealed problems. Some of the named vigilantes denied involvement. The geographic locations described didn't match territory the Benders were likely to have crossed. And most damning, the dying man had a history of tall tales and attention-seeking behavior. His confession was likely fantasy, a final grasp at significance before death. Yet the vigilante theory persisted because it satisfied a cultural need for justice. The public wanted to believe the Benders hadn't escaped, that frontier justice had succeeded where official law enforcement had failed. It was emotionally satisfying to imagine Kate's charming smile disappearing behind a noose, to picture the hammer fiend facing the violence he'd inflicted on others. Whether true or not, the story served a purpose. It gave closure to a case that otherwise remained frustratingly open. A second major theory suggested the Benders had successfully escaped to Mexico. This version was supported by a credible 1875 sighting in the border town of Laredo. A Pinkerton agent reported encountering a woman who perfectly matched Kate's description, working as a fortune teller and spiritualist under the name Maria Hernandez. She was accompanied by 3 family members, an older couple and a younger man, who matched the descriptions of the other Benders. The agent attempted to arrest them, but before he could secure assistance from local authorities, the family disappeared. Mexican officials were uncooperative, viewing American fugitive cases as low priority. The trail vanished south of the border, where American law enforcement had no jurisdiction, and where the vast, sparsely populated northern territories of Mexico offered perfect anonymity for fugitives. If the Benders had indeed reached Mexico, they could have lived out their lives in complete obscurity, never facing justice for their crimes. Perhaps the most intriguing theory came from Michigan in 1884. 2 women were arrested in Detroit for attempting to poison a wealthy elderly widow they'd been caring for. The older woman gave her name as Sarah Davis. The younger called herself Emma Ward. But witnesses who'd seen the wanted posters 11 years earlier swore they recognized the women as Elvira and Kate Bender. The physical descriptions matched. The older woman was tall, gaunt, and severe. The younger was attractive, educated, and had worked as a spiritualist before taking the caretaking position. Most compelling, when questioned, both women showed detailed knowledge of Kansas geography and became notably defensive when the Bender case was mentioned. The Sarah Davis name was significant. It was the alias Kate had reportedly used during the San Antonio sighting years earlier. Colonel York, still pursuing any credible lead despite advancing age, traveled to Michigan to identify the prisoners. He examined them closely, questioned them extensively, and compared them to his memories of the brief encounter with the Benders at the Cherryvale town meeting 11 years earlier. His conclusion was equivocal. He believed there was a strong possibility these were indeed Elvira and Kate, but he couldn't be absolutely certain. Memory was fallible, appearances changed with age, and he'd only seen the Benders once, over a decade earlier, in stressful circumstances. The women were tried for attempted murder and convicted based on evidence of the poisoning plot. They were sentenced to prison, where they maintained their innocence of any connection to the Bender crimes. The case became a cause célèbre, with newspapers debating whether justice had finally caught America's most wanted fugitives. But without definitive proof, no photographs, no fingerprints, no confession, the question remained unresolved. Sarah Davis died in prison in 1893, taking any secrets to her grave. Emma Ward was released in 1904 after serving her sentence, and immediately disappeared from public record. If they were the Benders, they never admitted it. If they weren't, they were victims of mistaken identity who'd been branded with crimes they didn't commit. The ambiguity was maddening for investigators and the public alike. Other sightings continued sporadically into the 1890s. A woman resembling Kate was spotted in San Francisco in 1887, working as a seamstress. A family matching the Benders' description was reported operating a boarding house in Denver in 1891. Each sighting was investigated, each proved inconclusive. The Benders, or people who resembled them, seemed to haunt the edges of American society, always just out of reach, always vanishing before they could be definitively identified. The psychological toll on the families of victims was immense. Without closure, without knowing the Benders had faced justice, grief couldn't fully resolve. Colonel York dedicated the remainder of his life to the search, pursuing leads even as his health failed. He died in 1884, 11 years after his brother's murder, without ever knowing with certainty what happened to the people who'd killed William York. His final words, according to family members, were questions about whether any new information had emerged about the Benders. The murder property itself became a macabre tourist attraction that persisted for years. The cabin, eventually torn down for souvenirs, was replaced by a commemorative marker that drew thousands of visitors annually. People came to stand where horrors had occurred, to imagine the hammer falling, to feel the thrill of proximity to genuine evil. The orchard was cleared, the trees destroyed, but the land retained its sinister reputation. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to build there. It became a wasteland, avoided by locals who believed it was cursed. Folklore grew around the site. People reported seeing ghostly figures near where the cabin had stood. A beautiful woman in a long dress, an old man with a hammer, shadowy forms moving through the darkness. These were likely projections of cultural trauma, the human need to literalize evil into something visible and containable. But the stories persisted, adding supernatural elements to a case that was horrifying enough without embellishment. The Bender legend influenced American culture in ways that extended far beyond the immediate case. They appeared in dime novels, in stage plays, in countless newspaper serializations that transformed fact into lurid fiction. Kate became the archetype of the beautiful female killer, a figure that would recur in American crime mythology for generations. The family itself became shorthand for domestic evil, the darkness that could hide behind the facade of normalcy. By the turn of the century, the active manhunt was officially over. The Pinkerton Agency closed its file in 1895, concluding that the Benders were either dead or so successfully hidden that discovery was impossible. Local law enforcement maintained the case as technically open, but no resources were devoted to investigation. The wanted posters yellowed and faded. The reward money went unclaimed. The bloody Benders had achieved a kind of immortality, not through justice, but through mystery. They'd vanished so completely that they'd transformed from criminals into myth, their actual fate obscured by decades of speculation, false sightings, and deliberate fabrications. Were they buried in an unmarked grave in Indian Territory, living under assumed names in Mexico? Did they die in prison as the Detroit Poisoners? Or had they simply integrated into society somewhere, abandoning murder and living out quiet lives that never connected back to the horrors of the Kansas prairie? The answer, if it existed, was lost to history. But the question remained, haunting American consciousness like the ghost stories told about the murder property. Somewhere, perhaps, the truth waited to be discovered. But as years became decades, and decades approached a century, that truth seemed destined to remain forever out of reach. More than a century and a half has passed since the bloody Benders murdered their last victim and vanished into the American landscape. The canvas curtain has long since been cut into souvenirs and scattered to collectors. The orchard that grew from human remains was torn out decades ago. The very earth that held those shallow graves has been turned over by plows and time, erasing the physical evidence of horror that once lay beneath. Yet the Benders refuse to be forgotten. Their story endures because it touches something primal in the human psyche. The fear that evil can wear a familiar face, that monsters don't announce themselves with fangs and claws, but with smiles and hospitality. The Benders proved that an entire family could be corrupted, that the home itself could become a trap, that the very institutions meant to provide safety could be weaponized by those who understood how trust operates. Modern criminologists study the Bender case as an early example of organized serial killing, a precursor to the criminal enterprises that would emerge in the 20th century. The family's methodology, victim selection, systematic execution, body disposal, and the maintenance of a normal facade anticipated patterns that law enforcement wouldn't fully understand for another 100 years. They were innovators in evil, creating a template that others would unfortunately follow. The unanswered question of their fate has spawned continuing investigation even in the 21st century. In 2013, a team of forensic anthropologists and historians attempted to locate the Bender graves, using ground-penetrating radar and historical records to search areas where vigilante executions might have occurred. They found nothing conclusive, some anomalies in the earth that might be unmarked graves, but no remains that could be definitively linked to the Bender family. DNA technology offers theoretical possibilities that didn't exist in 1873. If remains believed to be the Benders were discovered, if descendants of the family could be located for comparison samples, modern science might finally answer the question that eluded Colonel York and the Pinkerton detectives. But without a starting point, without knowing where to look or what to look for, even advanced forensics can't solve a mystery this cold. Some historians have suggested that the Benders' disappearance might be the most significant aspect of their story. By escaping justice, they created a different kind of terror, the fear that evil can go unpunished, that monsters can simply walk away from their crimes and disappear. This violated fundamental beliefs about moral order, about justice being inevitable, about the universe correcting its imbalances. The Benders got away with it, and that reality is more disturbing than any ghost story. The property where the murders occurred is unremarkable now. The land changed hands multiple times over the decades, each owner trying to escape the stigma of the location's history. Current owners report no supernatural activity, no lingering darkness, just ordinary Kansas prairie. The murder site has been absorbed back into the landscape, indistinguishable from thousands of other parcels of farmland across the Midwest. But in Cherryvale, Kansas, memory persists. The local museum maintains a Bender exhibit displaying artifacts from the era, copies of wanted posters, and photographs of the murder cabin before it was demolished. Tour guides recount the story for visitors who come seeking connection to a legendary crime. The town has made an uneasy peace with its dark history, acknowledging the past while trying not to be defined solely by the horrors that occurred there. Each generation rediscovers the Benders, reinterpreting their story through contemporary lenses. In the 1950s, they were seen as aberrations, freakish exceptions to American normalcy. In the 1970s, during the serial killer panic, they were studied as early examples of a phenomenon that seemed to be accelerating. In recent years, true crime podcasts and documentary series have revisited the case, using modern investigative techniques and psychological profiling to analyze what drove the family to such systematic evil. These reexaminations reveal as much about the present as they do about the past. Each era finds in the Benders a reflection of its own anxieties, about family, about strangers, about the dangers lurking beneath civilized surfaces. The story is endlessly adaptable, endlessly relevant, because the fears it triggers are timeless. What drove them? This question haunts everyone who encounters the case. Greed explains the immediate motive. They stole money and possessions from victims. But it doesn't explain the scale, the duration, the apparent lack of remorse. 11 confirmed murders, possibly dozens more across multiple locations and years. That level of sustained violence suggests something beyond simple robbery. Some psychologists have theorized that the Benders represented a folie à famille, a shared psychosis where an entire family unit becomes trapped in delusional or criminal thinking. Kate might have been the charismatic leader, convincing her family that victims were less than human, that murder was simply business. Others suggest sociopathy wasn't inherited but cultivated, that the family created an insular moral universe where only their own survival mattered and outsiders were legitimate prey. The truth is we'll never know their internal experience. We'll never understand what they said to each other in German behind that canvas curtain, what justifications they constructed, what emotions they felt, if any, watching a 3-year-old child's grave being filled with earth. The psychological landscape of the Benders remains as mysterious as their physical fate. For the families of victims, closure never fully arrived. The descendants of Dr. William York, of George Lawnchair, of William Jones and his daughter, they carry the weight of knowing their ancestors died terrified and alone, murdered for pocket change by people they trusted enough to share a meal with. Some family lines maintain the story across generations, ensuring the victims are remembered as people, not just entries in a ledger of horrors. The Bender case changed American law enforcement permanently. It demonstrated the need for coordinated multi-jurisdictional investigation, for systematic tracking of missing persons, for treating patterns of disappearance as potential evidence of serial crime. The informal network of sheriffs and marshals that Colonel York established evolved eventually into the federal law enforcement apparatus that exists today. The Bender's escape helped create the systems designed to prevent future monsters from similarly vanishing. In that sense, their victims didn't die entirely in vain. The horror of the Bender murders forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about frontier justice, about the vulnerabilities created by isolation and poor communication, about the need for professional, organized law enforcement. The case was a catalyst for change, a dark lesson that reshaped how crime was investigated and prosecuted. But that's cold comfort to those who lived through the terror, who discovered what their neighbors had been, who walked past that cabin never knowing the horrors occurring inside. The survivors carried trauma that no subsequent reforms could heal. They'd learned that evil could be domestic, familial, and methodical. They'd learned that trust was dangerous. They'd learned that the monsters were real, and sometimes they won. What's your take on this case? Did the Benders escape to live out their lives unpunished? Or did frontier justice catch them in some unmarked grave lost to history? Could an entire family truly share such moral corruption? Or was Kate the mastermind who corrupted the others? And most haunting, could something like this happen today, in our connected, surveilled digital world? Or do monsters like the Benders still exist, hiding behind ordinary faces, waiting for isolation and opportunity to align? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking, and some questions echo across centuries, demanding answers that history may never provide. The bloody Benders vanished into legend, but their shadows remain, reminding us that the darkest evils often hide behind the most welcoming smiles, that family can mean murder as easily as it means safety, and that some mysteries are destined to haunt us forever, unsolved, unresolved, and utterly unforgettable.